Thank you all very much. Can I just ask you one question? One of the things that I think looks very frightening from here is that at almost all 20th century economic crisis that we went through, there was an alternative intellectual model available. That during the 1930s there was something called Keynesianism, and when you look at the history of the 1930s and 40s, things like the XYZ Club, very clever people spent a lot of time developing the policy into something that could then be implemented in different ways in 1945. During, whether you like it or not, during the last crisis that we really went through, when the unions were genuinely out of control, when there was a real sense that British decline, which we haven't talked about, was absolute, non-reversible. Britain wasn't just a declining place, it was an over place. There was economic liberalism, which may have been wrong, but did have some of the answers. It seems to me that there is also a really rather interesting and challenging and an opportunity, but also quite scary. There is no intellectual narrative around which talks us out of this. What do you think? Is that true? You know much more than me.
Well, I think the thing that's very striking from the perspective of the way that people understood the international economy when they were trying to rebuild it in the Second World War, when the biggest fear was as the world came out of the Second World War, that it would dive straight into another Great Depression, and there was a sense that nationalism, that everybody had their own recovery plans in 1944-45, and there was sort of the Bretton Woods, which was an emergency scheme in some senses, and also a sense of planning in the longer term, but there was Beveridge, and that was a British national response, is that there was always a worry that you would have a technocratic, scientific solution rather than a democratic one. And it's also this sense of Will's point about insiders and outsiders and where the role of the
disconnect between economics and politics.
That's right.
Which is really
that's
dangerous.
Right. And in a sense, we have the IMF and the World Bank, but since 1944, there was a debate, or there's been an ongoing debate about how the IMF and the World Bank connects to the United Nations, connects to the European Union, connects to questions about the climate, and how to reposition people's voices within that. The League of Nations, which was a failed organisation, was at least a united one and had all of these different elements within it. And world government, though of course it failed miserably in the 1930s, was a sort of a plan of that. But yeah, history is not a good guide in that sense to where to find expertise now.
Mark.
Oh, well,
clean up the language.
I think you're right that there isn't an overarching intellectual framework. I mean, just to make a very contemporary point, I accept Will's contention really that Brown is very easily considered in too harsh a way, but it's surely one of the real problems facing him and his credibility, so to say, is that it's not believable that he has himself ditched the set of beliefs and ideologies and experiences and so on which brought him into politics, and he's a thoughtful man and he's an intellectual, and which powered him until a few years ago, and yet he wants us now to believe that that didn't happen, that wasn't true, and that it has no bearing on the world we're in now. And it's simply not credible, I think.
Well, of course, I think that's, my God, Gordon Brown. I mean, it is a really extraordinary trajectory that Gordon Brown has taken. I mean, a man of the moderate social democratic left in the 80s, who, modified that position in the 90s to co-produce New Labour with Gordon Brown and with Tony Blair, Peter Mandelson and others. Engaged in what they tell me they now call politics of assurance, was what they were doing.
But they weren't enormously sympathetic to people saying aren't public-private partnerships actually rather an obscene way of managing things like the NHS, which we hold very dear.
No, all of that. I mean,
and you couldn't say it. I mean, you couldn't. You could, but one couldn't say it. One was just an old Oldsmobile.
Exactly, and we're just chatting about the state we're in, and I wrote the state we're in the mid-90s, and and it was at that. I mean, it was hardly. It is a kind of a political economy with its lineage in Keynes and Galbraith, and it was trying to come up with a kind of doable set of policies for an incoming kind of Labour government in the kind of circumstance which we found ourselves in the late 90s. But I was far too, to regulate the financial system in the way that I advocated then was seen as absolutely, radical and anti-business and leftist and doomed to failure, and also and intellectually wrong and old Labour. And you were made to feel that you were something the cat brought in, really. And they were engaged in the politics of assurance. They wanted to prove to the business community that they were, more pro-business than the Tories, than even the wealth generators themselves. I mean, some things that Gordon Brown said and did in that period. I mean, lauding the city, fighting against any kind of regulation, designing the FSA so it didn't actually, do the systemic test that now they say they need to, because it would, might inhibit bankers' ability to kind of develop these products, defending tax havens. Was resisting European initiatives to develop a common withholding tax because it might inhibit the growth of the City of London. Setting as one of the 5 tests for British membership of the Euro. Do you remember that? One of the 5 tests was not manufacturing. It was actually would it be good or not for the city. I mean, all of this, and then we're asked to kind of. Then he stands up on Thursday evening and gives this speech talking about a new order and a new principle of capitalism and how all that stuff was rotten. And it is incredible, and it's debilitating for the British left. But there isn't a champion who's plausible on the Labour Party to take him on. If there were, he would have been taken on last summer, I have no doubt. It's perfectly possible that when Labour loses. He'll be leader of the opposition, and won't be able to get out of his ML either. So the left is in that place, and then the Conservative Party are riven between knowing that actually the agenda is the agenda of the G20, and knowing that's where actually a level-headed politician of today has to be, but having strong nationalist, Eurosceptic, and free market fundamentalist strains that have not really been argued out of the party. And so, there is the grave risk that the Tory party took office in 2010, that they could hold a referendum on the European Union, which would set in place a dynamic of us leaving the Union, at just the moment we just stay in it. They could, the things they could do could be phenomenally destructive, and an awful lot lies, in the hands of 4 or 5 people who've got control of the Tory party, trying to pull it back to the centre ground. If for any reason they were to lose control of the Tory party, we have no idea what would happen to the British state. There's a really parlous state for British politics to be in my view.